All right. Good afternoon and good evening. Looks like we've had attendees from all over the world today. So when I first started, it was good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Now I think it's just good evening and good afternoon. So I'm excited. My name's Scott Shaw. I'm your host today. Really quick, I want to thank the sponsors for doing an amazing job this week, and thank you guys for them. We couldn't have done it without you. Please, when you get a chance, check out our Momentum website for all our sponsor pages so you can learn more about them. Right before we kick off, I just want to go over a little bit of housekeeping. If you are on the Zoom, you'll see a chat button and a QA button. If you have any technical difficulties or you want to talk directly to me, the host, just pop that right into your chat button. If you have questions for the speaker, Chris, please put that in the QA button. This is recorded today, and the deck along with it will be sent out to all the attendees and registrants. So we're excited to have this session. And let's get started. So in this session today, we will learn the power of how great conversations can yield great results. We have an awesome speaker today. His name is Chris Beal. Chris is the CEO of Connect and Sell. To me, he has revolutionized the outbound unscheduled call. And if you want to know a little fact about Chris, he's also a product and techie geek. He has over 17 patents to his name. So let's welcome Chris Beal.
Wow, that's something. I hadn't thought about them 17 patents for a while. That's kind of fun. Thanks. Thanks a lot, Scott. Yeah, you know, it's kind of strange when you start out as a techie. I started out worse than a techie, actually, so I always feel like I should kind of apologize. You know, I started out as a physicist, mathematician who went through a process out of necessity of learning how to knock on doors and be a Fuller Brush man in Arizona in the summer, way back long time ago. And I was already in love with business because I had business books around the house growing up. And so I was reading books by the greats. I didn't know, you know, it's just the books in the house, right? You read what's around. So reading Peter Drucker and folks like that. So I was always interested in business, but I didn't like the idea of sales. I thought sales was kind of like this grotty thing that, you know, salespeople did, until I went out and knocked on doors and learned something about sales. And the main thing I learned was it was really not about how many doors I knocked on. It was about the conversations that happened when people opened those doors. And so when I finally ran into Sean McLaren, the founder of Connect and Sell, back in 2011, I was probably more primed than I thought to be interested in what he was talking about, because he was talking about, hey, you know, Chris, everybody's trying to grow all these companies. We're in Silicon Valley, so everybody's trying to grow these companies, venture finance companies, and they're trying to grow them with headcount, especially sales headcount. And sales headcount is, you know, it's hard to find and takes a long time to onboard people, and there's all that going on. We have a way, he said, of just letting the headcount that you have lots more conversations. And as a result, you can get better at having those conversations, and you can figure out how to have them with the right people. And he actually said this very thing that's on the slide, which is, you know, growth is about conversations, not headcount. And I think most of us would think, well, that's not a revolutionary idea. I mean, isn't it the case that if we just do a thought experiment and say, hey, if we could have 10 times as many conversations, 20 times, 50 times, 1,000 times as many conversations, we would grow faster. After all, we don't tend to be able to get very far with somebody in business to business without having a conversation with them. And if we had more, that would be better. But I think we tend to just think, well, we're constrained by some facts of the world, mostly that it's really hard to get conversations with invisible strangers that are out there in the world somewhere. It's hard to get those conversations above a certain rate. And therefore, in order to grow, we have to scale our headcount. And I would claim that my experience, you know, now as CEO of Connect and Sell, but also 40 years of building tech companies from scratch, often being the guy who wrote the code, that there's other elements that we can take control of. And now that we're in this COVID situation, and everybody would love it to be a post-COVID situation, but it probably won't be for a while. So now that we're in this COVID situation, there are a lot of constraints on headcount, and we're having to figure out how to do things more efficiently. Companies like mine are of some interest, and I think all of our sponsors are of interest to folks that are trying to make sales happen in this sort of pandemic world that we live in. So before the pandemic, most companies, especially in tech or growth companies, were desperately seeking more heads, fighting over heads, saying, you know, can I get this 22-year-old person to come work for us, and what can I do in order to make that happen, in competition with the company down the street? Do we need a chef? Do we need you know, dog massages? Do we need extra ping pong tables, video game corners? What do we really need in order to get the heads to join? And to some people, it got almost a little bit silly, but companies tend not to do things that are actually silly. They do things that are needed. There's not a lot of, you know, just sort of like feelings going around. There's testing of hypotheses, and folks were doing what was needed. They needed more heads. And that made sense in a way, and it especially made sense to investors. Think of yourself not as somebody who's either, say, running a sales organization or running a sales development organization, or being a sales development representative or anything like that, or even being like me, a CEO of a company. Think of being on the other side. You've written the check. So you've written the check, and you'd love to see concrete things happen with that money. You want to see your money go to work. After all, if you wanted to put it in the bank, you wouldn't have written the check because it was already in the bank. So you want the money to go to work, and you want concrete, visible evidence that the money is going to work. Well, nothing is more concrete and visible and predictable than hiring people. So you want the companies that you invest in, if you're a growth investor or a venture investor, which is the most extreme form of growth investor. That's a growth investor, by the way, expects a failure rate that's in the 90% level or thereabouts. You want your investment to go to work. You want your money to go to work, and you want it to go to work like other money has gone to work. So if hiring people is the thing that we can measure, that we can do, you can go out, you can recruit, you can advertise, you can do all manner of things to hire people, and you know you have them when you have them, then you're making progress toward the goal of growth by hiring more heads. And so that was before the pandemic, and we've been through this many times. That was also before the crash of 2007, 8, 9. That was before the crash of 2001, which I remember very, very vividly, as the world of technology basically kind of shut down with regard to venture capital and growth. I know some people who are listening to me now probably are thinking, 2001, I was pretty young then. Well, I wasn't, and so I can remember that one pretty clearly. So we've been through this cycle several times, and what happens when there's a constraint, a capital constraint is what you could consider it, that goes across the entire economy, including the growth economy, there's an emphasis that shows up on what's called capital efficiency. That is, the money needs to produce more outcome per dollar invested. And so capital efficiency and seeking more heads don't go together that well. That is, people are expensive. They're expensive to pay, but that's the least of it. They're expensive to find. They're expensive to onboard. They're expensive to wash out when you've hired somebody and you're just about to put them in the seat, so to speak, and have them start down that path of being productive, and then they're lured away by another company. Well, that's a lot of money that went effectively nowhere. So all of these costs are hiding inside of seeking more heads. There's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of costs in there, but it seemed like there was no alternative. But you know how necessity is the mother of invention. Scott mentioned that I have 17 patents. Some of those probably represent actual inventions. And I can guarantee you every single one of them was an invention out of necessity. It's never, hey, I got a great idea. It's always, oh my God, I got a hard problem to solve. And eventually, maybe by some combination of luck and putting stuff together, hey, here's something that actually solves it. and it's novel and it's useful and it's not obvious to somebody who is skilled in the art and maybe worth filing a patent on. So we need to be more like inventors now and try to invent ways of getting more with those investor dollars that we have before they run out. So, you know, during the pandemic, we were just really, we had this problem that showed up. And the problem showed up in two dimensions. One is that the venture capital or investor capital itself began to get more constrained, usually a constrained feeling after all the checks already been written. So this thing called extending the runway needed to happen. Lots of companies made some cuts to compensation in some way. And some of them made, and many actually, made changes in terms of their headcount. And they furloughed people or laid folks off. And there were some pretty dramatic ones in our industry. I think one of our companies in our industry that is very well funded, I think may have let something like 100 people go. Those are really, really tough things to do. And they're very distracting, and you really can't tell if you've got the right people or not. Sometimes management gets a little dispirited as a result. Takes your eye off the ball in terms of your own customers, but it has to be done because running out of money is not considered to be an option in business. It's one that we avoid at all costs. So it's one thing to survive, though. The question is, can we grow? Can we grow with fewer heads? Because now our premise was always headcount leads to growth, and we knew it was challenging and hard to do and all that kind of stuff. But is it actually possible to survive and grow with fewer heads? And if so, what do we need to focus on? And it is possible. It really is possible. But it takes focusing on something different. So our Momentum 2020 organizer is in the business of conversational intelligence. So their thesis is, hey, if you get better at having conversations, you can get more juice out of each conversation, and you can kind of fly ahead. You can be the guy with the rocket ship on his back. I always worry as an old physicist is going to do something bad to his heels, but I guess I take things a little bit literally. By the way, he should have that thing pointed up a little bit too, otherwise it's going to skip on the ground, but that's just the way it is. So, you know, if you could get more out of each conversation, get better, then you don't need quite as many people. So that shows right there, if we believe that to be true, it shows us that conversations, taking a conversation with somebody and turning it into the output, which is either a meeting, a yes, or a disqualification that we believe, a no, those are really valuable, or a not me, then whom, a referral, or the most common, not now. Then if we can get that outcome, we can have more yeses, and the yeses lead to meetings, and the meetings lead to opportunities, and the opportunities lead to deals, and the deals lead to bookings growth, and bookings growth eventually leads to revenue growth. They are decoupled a little bit, but they tend to come back together at some point. So we could just do it by having better conversations. There's no doubt about that. And that is, you know, a fantastic thing to be able to do. We could do it by having conversations with more relevant people. And one of our sponsors, ZoomInfo, makes sure that that can happen. That we can have those conversations with more relevant people. In this time of pandemic, one of the things that happens is that as companies shrink, they also change a lot. So we've got to find data that'll allow us to keep up with all that change. It's typical that 3 to 3.5% of everybody we would talk to or try to talk to in May, by June, they're doing a different job, maybe somewhere else. So it's important to keep up with change, always has been. Well, now we've had discontinuous change. And discontinuous change means there's so much to keep up with. What are we going to do? Well, the really high quality data providers, that's their job, is they're out there combing through the world, calling people, looking at data, sending out emails, looking at bounce rates, all that kind of stuff. So we could do a better job by having better data. And why? Because by having more of our conversations with more relevant people, we're going to have more conversations that lead to good places. So that's all to the good. And we can also have more conversations by simply having more activity per day. That's what folks like Outreach are going to let us do. is, hey, we have a lot of emails to send, we have a lot of social outreach to do. How are we going to organize our day so more of it is productive and less of it is waste? And how are we going to do it in a way that matches up with how people are consuming what it is that we're putting out, so that they're more likely to look on it favorably and want to take a meeting with us? So that's sort of time management in the digital space. So we could be doing that. So yeah, we know these techniques can be used to grow without adding heads. But now that we've probably had the heads shrunk, we've, so to speak, and I'm not referring to going to a psychiatrist, but now that we've had the world change around us, we're probably having to look more closely at these approaches and the technologies behind them. Then there's another huge change. And this one is actually positive, but we think it's negative, which is the work from home mandate, so to speak, which in the state of Washington, where I live, was a mandate by the governor. Effectively, if you read it carefully, it said you were going to work from home unless you're an essential worker, and us knowledge workers are it's not essential that we commute. Work from home turned out to come with a big improvement in productivity. And our friends over at Protoscore, they measure productivity at the desktop directly. And I know folks like Microsoft do this with their own employees. Protoscore does it across the board, and they measured 147%, 47% growth, productivity at 147% of what it was before from work from home, partially because the distraction of the commute is gone, partially because we've adopted more of a habit of sitting and working and not talking to each other quite as much, which I think at the office, there are some folks whose purpose in going to the office might have been a little bit more social than it was anything else. I may have been accused of that once or twice myself. Maybe that's why I went on so many trips on airplanes, to get away so people could do some work. So work from home was a huge change, and it actually is helping us. It turns out that we're getting about a 50% pop just for that. That's kind of amazing. We can take advantage of that. And then there's kind of another question, which is, can we do this? Can we just plain old have more conversations? This sounds impossible. After all, if we're talking about, I'm talking about human conversations, by the way. Now, why would I talk about human conversations? Because the bottleneck actually in business-to-business sales, well, it appears to be kind of over a number of steps in the process. The bottleneck actually turns out to be inside the first conversation. And the reason is first conversations fail, cold calls fail so often that we usually have to have a lot of them in order to get concrete results that we can work with. The average sales rep today has, if they're using the phone, which is hard to do, has probably 3 or 4 conversations a day, real conversations during which they can build trust. The problem with business to business is we can't grow unless the folks who are buying get to a threshold value of trust that is very unusual. They don't need to trust us more than they trust our competitor. They actually need to trust us more than they trust themselves, because they're putting their career on the line. They're putting their kids' college education, their retirement, their reputation, their career on the line when they make a buying decision. And that means they have to trust us because we're the expert. The expert is always the specialist. We're the specialist. We're solving a specific problem. They're the generalist. That's why they come to vendors who provide solutions for them. So as the expert, we have to get in a position where we are more trusted by the prospect than they trust themselves. And trust is a funny thing. Now, Chris Voss, who wrote the book Never Split the Difference, How to Negotiate as If Your Life Depends on It, he told me something one night that really kind of changed my world. I asked him, how long do we have to get someone to trust us in a cold call? And he just said 7 seconds. I said, wow, 7 seconds. That's like, our research says 8 seconds. I was joking. Bourbon was involved. Right? And he didn't crack a smile. He just said, your research is wrong. 7 seconds. And I realized, well, wait, if we need to get trust in business to business kind of transactions, and we only have 7 seconds to get that trust, and it has to be the human voice. We can't do it by sending somebody an email. They're not going to trust us as a result of that. There's not enough information in an email. An email is maybe 5,000 bits of information. That's 1/4 of 1 second of a live conversation. it's going to take several seconds. Say it takes 7, right? So 7 times 4 is 28. 28 emails worth of information is going to need to go from one person to another to move the trust needle. So if, we got to be good at doing that. But if we do get good at doing that, is it possible for us to just have more conversations? And here's where you get into a chicken and egg problem, and it's really kind of a tough one. Having great conversations in which we get someone to trust us in 7 seconds, and then actually get them to consider being curious enough to take a meeting with us or with a colleague, getting great at something requires doing a lot of it. Getting great at something really, really hard, like that thing is probably harder than the golf swing. That really requires tons of practice. And the practice needs to be under the emotional conditions in which we're going to perform. And sadly, it's hard to come up with those emotional conditions except for live fire. So our chicken and egg problem is we need to have lots of live fire conversations in order to get good at having live fire conversations. If we had a mechanism that would let us have lots of conversations, that would be great. That's what we sell at Connect and Sell, is that mechanism. But we also have got to have great conversations. That's where exec vision comes in. We've got to have conversations with relevant people. That's where Zoom Info comes in. We've got to be able to use the rest of the tools that we have. And that's where Speckett comes in, is learning how to navigate all our CRMs and all our digital tools, and not just spend our time hitting buttons that don't make any sense to us and then doing it in the wrong order or whatever. But at some point, we've got to have lots of those conversations where that 7 seconds to get trust is built in. And it turns out that to do that, we have to recognize where the waste is. The waste is not actually where most folks think it is. First of all, it's not fear. Your fear as a rep is not the issue. Your prospect's fear is not the issue either. It's an advantage. Prospect is afraid of you because you're an invisible stranger, and that gives you a place to start 100% of the time. By relieving their fear and offering an alternative to being afraid of the invisible stranger, they can trust you, and after they trust you, you can offer something that lets them be curious. So that's straightforward and easy to do. It's been figured out how to do that down to the very words. And if you're willing to speak the words and do it with the right tone of voice and have the right underlying belief, which is a belief in the potential value of this meeting you have on offer, that you're offering for this human being you're speaking with, in the case where you're never going to do business together, if you can believe that, and that belief comes out in your voice, and then you say the words that are most likely to work, you can actually have conversations at sort of an optimal level of trust building and results producing. But the problem is people have become very, very hard to reach on the phone. And why are they hard to reach on the phone? Oddly, it's because of 2003, 4, and 5, where voicemail became ubiquitous. Salespeople started using voicemail when it was opened up outside of companies. I know a lot of people aren't old enough to remember voicemail used to be an internal thing. And then when the price of storage became very, very cheap, voicemail was okay to store more of it. So why not open it up? And when it was opened up, people would leave voicemails that were pretty much spam. And now, by the way, many salespeople leave lots of voicemails that are pretty much spam. And so folks have acquired the habit of not listening to voicemails and not responding to them, and that's a problem. So the problem is that about 95% of all dials will be navigated to voicemail. And that's on some days is worse. I was looking at our team today. It's taking 46.11 dials today so far to get somebody on the phone, somebody to answer the phone. And these are targeted people, not their gatekeepers, not their voicemails, and not certainly their phone systems. So is it possible to have more conversations? It turns out it is. You can outsource the navigation of phone calls. That's what we do. We have some competitors who do it. You can also just take other waste out, but the big waste turns out to be the navigation of phone calls that end up in voicemail. It's as simple as that. If 95% of your time is spent commuting to the job is the conversation. Think of the conversation like your office, like a job site, like those of you who used to commute, you remember you might go and get in your car and get out on a freeway. I used to commute to San Mateo from San Jose. sit there in traffic for an hour and 15 minutes, slowly moving along, you know, trying to avoid hitting people and stuff like that. And you know, that commute time, it's very hard for it not to be a waste because your attention is on something else, driving the car. In this case, your attention is on navigating phone systems, and you can't do other work. You can't send emails, you can't run your outreach sequences, you can't do research on who to talk to when you're busy navigating phone systems. So that's most of the time. And if you could squish that down and make it go away and give it to somebody else to do, then you might be able to have more conversations. So that's kind of the impossible alternative. So the first alternative was have better conversations. And that's by having them with more relevant people. So go talk to ZoomInfo about that and doing a better job on them. So you go talk to ExecVision about conversational intelligence where you'll do a better job. Not wasting your time on all your digital tools that you haven't learned how to use yet, taking too long to onboard and so forth, just with regard to the mechanics. Go talk to Speckett about that. So these things need to be solved, but you can also solve this one, which is just have tons more conversations. So, you know, when you come right down to it, here's the pivot, and I think it's going to stick. I tend to believe also that the commute is kind of gone forever. I think that one's going to stick. I think work from home is going to be modified somewhat with some hybridization, but I think that one's going to stick. I think conferences like this, where we're you know, getting together without us having to commute. I didn't have to commute very far to be a speaker at this conference. Where I sleep is about 22 feet that direction, and the kitchen and coffee maker is about 18 feet in that direction. That's a short commute compared to the 9 hours it takes to get to the airport, go through security, get an airplane, fly across the country, get off the airplane, probably go to a hotel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we think about taking all that waste out, because by the way, commuting to a conference as a speaker is pure waste. So we find out that we can get the job done without the waste being in there. And while we might have loved going to the conference for other reasons, and we did. I remember sitting with Steve Richard at a conference once, and we probably would have never come up with the phrase, we amplify suck, which is one of my company's watchwords or watch phrases, if we hadn't been sitting there at breakfast before he was going to go on stage. And I've always said that one thing I will never do is follow Steve Richard on stage. I had to do it once. It was embarrassing. Never want to be behind a guy that's that good. So yeah, we loved being there for all this other stuff. But let's face it, if we can get 90% of the job done without commuting for hours, or in the case of conversation, for about an hour to get a conversation, then that's probably going to be here to stay. So the old plan was we hired, and we did lots of hiring, recruiting and hiring, recruiting and hiring, recruiting and hiring. If you were a big time growth-oriented sales leader, you always talked on your LinkedIn, on your resume, if people still did resumes, about how many people worked for you. I'll led a team of 120 people or whatever it happens to be. I remember speaking with somebody once at a lunch, and his job was to hire 300 people for an insurance-oriented kind of company that will remain unnamed, venture finance, with lots and lots and lots of venture money. And I asked him if instead of hiring 300 people, I could show you how to get the job done with 50, would that be of interest? Sounds like a no-brainer to me. And he said, Chris, my job is to hire 300 people. That's what our investors want us to do. That's my job. Made sense, right? Because that's what scale was all about, and why go through all the effort of putting money into a business and taking it out to market unless you're going to scale. So the skepticism on the part of the investors is always around scale, and scale always came down to hiring. Then we had onboarding. Now, I remember at one of our customers, I asked them when we just started with them, how long does it take for you to onboard an SDR? They call them something different, but let's call them an SDR. And they said, oh, we've got it down to 3 months. Okay. So why did it take 3 months? Well, part of it is there's kind of a thrash around the whole hiring process. And so there's sort of, I don't know, almost a backwash afterwards of confusion. You've kind of got to get a cohort together, so you onboard them all at the same time. So there's some delay as you wait for the cohort to come together. And then there's lots and lots and lots of stuff to learn. And I think we have tended to overteach on in that phase. We've overtaught about the product. It turns out if your product is a meeting, you don't really need to learn everything about your product, except it's really valuable, except it solves a problem and that you believe in it enough to work there. But you don't really need to know much more about it, but you do need to know what somebody's going to learn in a discovery meeting. And so that's one of those kind of things. You could get the onboarding down. There's a lot of waste there. And you get it down, I think, just by saying, hey, how long does it take to have a newly hired person have their first reasonably competent conversation with an invisible stranger? I think that answer is 1 day, by the way, 1 day. So the 3 months that this particular customer is rather proud of, that is now for that customer down to not 1 day, but they've got it down to a couple of weeks. I still think it could be 1 day. Then we also had, oh, well, we have to scale throughout the organization. So we hire at the top of the funnel, hire SDRs, BDRs, whatever. We're calling them this week. And we groom them for future jobs as account executives. I actually think that this is something that is an artifact of the idea that we need to scale with outbound in terms of headcount. So if we can scale with efficiency, at least for a while, then we could actually leave people in the role a little bit longer and let them do it professionally. At our company, we actually have people in the SDR role who are almost as old as me. And I hesitate to tell you how old that really is. But I can tell you that I started my first company in 1983, and it wasn't in the first year that I was working in tech. So we think a lot about that. Just about when somebody learns the job, we tend to promote them out. Again, if we can be more efficient in the first 2 steps, if we can hire fewer folks and onboard them faster, we might be able to have them in the job longer because they're working during what would have been the onboarding period. Also, if the job is more satisfying and they're talking to more people, maybe it's okay to have them do it longer, and maybe it's a profession. Think of that. I actually believe the SDR job is the hardest and most important job in a company. And I don't think it's a temporary role that you flow through, not optimally for the company. I actually believe that it can be a very specialized piece of work to do and of incredible value. This is where your company meets the market. So the pivot, the pandemic pivot, so to speak, is get better with targeting. And here's one thing you can do that's super simple, make a big difference. Take your target list and make sure it's your whole target list. So your market is always a list. It's never an idea. It's always a list. It's a list of companies and therefore people at companies, hypothetically, that you believe if you were to sell to one of them, everyone else on that list is more likely to buy from you at your current price or a higher price. So that's the definition of a market. Everybody on the list influences everybody else on the list in a positive way with regard to your offering. So you make that list, but you've got to get the right people. So 2 big mistakes are worth avoiding. Mistake number 1, treating all titles the same. I get to see a lot of lists. We do these things called intensive test drives. We do about 600 a year, and folks bring their own lists. And we get to look at those lists, and sometimes we're quite shocked to see some list that contains vice presidents at billion-dollar companies mixed in with vice presidents at $20 million companies. So if your market actually does span big ranges of company sizes, which it probably shouldn't, but if it does, your lists still need to be separate in terms of the big having the lower titles and the small having the bigger titles. Now, as a CEO of a smallish company compared to these big monsters, you could probably cold call me and talk to me about anything. I might send you away. That could be, as an asker, by the way, hire askers, don't hire guessers. People who know how to ask and get a no, not people who insist that everybody read their mind. So if you're a good asker and you ask me for something, like to attend a meeting about something, I might say no, but at least I know what you're talking about within my organization, because I'm the CEO of a much smaller company than, say, Satya Nadella, the CEO over at Microsoft, who might literally not know what you're speaking about within his company. So get the titles matched up with the size of the companies into separate lists. Then, before you start doing anything resembling calling or emailing or whatever, take the list through a pivot table and sort it descending on the number of instances of each title. The reason you do this is you're looking for the first dumb title that's got the highest count of instances. Because I don't care how good you are at querying Zoom or querying LinkedIn Sales Navigator or querying anything else under the sun. Your query, if it's a good query, will always pick up false positives. This is the same reason that Google shows you stuff that's great and stuff that's not great. Because the very nature of search, in which I hold actually a lot of those patents that Scott was talking about, is that good search yields false positives. And so, in fact, everything in sales, discovery meetings, they're a form of search. Everything must yield false positives. Otherwise, you're too tight in your search criteria and you're missing the good stuff. So there's false positives in there. And what do they look like? Who knows? They might say assistant to the president, and you're trying to talk to the president. It doesn't make any difference what they are. You could spot them with your eye in chunks and get rid of them. Because if they're worth calling, they're worth inspecting. But don't inspect them one at a time. Don't alphabetize and inspect them. Chunk them and inspect them. So get your targeting right. Then you get your messaging right. And it has to be in that order because you're going to test the message across a stable target audience. So if you want to be conversation focused, you need to come up with the message that avoids all marketing talk, 100% of the marketing talk. It's focused entirely on helping somebody be curious enough to want to attend a meeting. Your message needs to avoid the category of product that you're offering, because if you say the category of product, you'll get a very simple response, which is, yeah, we're set. There's not much you can do about that one. I know people write books about objection handling. That's an objection and that you're going to have a hard time handling when somebody claims information superiority over you based on information superiority. They really do know what they have. And even if they're not quite right, it's hard to argue that one. So no, you don't is not great. So get your messaging right. The messaging is entirely about the emotional flow, psychological flow of the conversation. And what you're trying to do is to get somebody sufficiently curious and trusting in order to take a meeting, and even if they don't take the meeting, for them to trust you. So when you talk to them next quarter, you're going to have a better conversation. Because if you're going to use conversations to scale your business, you can't just use them in this quarter. You're going to be using them in every quarter. And they're not all with folks you haven't talked to before. Over time, there are folks you have talked with before. So you've got to build trust everywhere. And then put that to work by having good conversations and having lots and lots of conversations. I probably already know how I think that you might want to give that a shot, but that's not really the relevant issue. The relevant issue ultimately is if you're going to scale without adding lots and lots of heads. And in this post-pandemic world, we all have got to do it. We've got to scale revenue without scaling headcount. We've got to get really, really good at having conversations. And then it's okay to turn the dial on having more conversations. But there is that chicken and egg problem. Because until we're having live fire conversations, it's kind of hard to know if our message is any good. It's a little bit hard to know if our targeting's good, but we should not thrash around in the targeting. Move around in the messaging. That's easier and faster. Leave the targeting alone. It's a last resort. And let the conversations guide you into the market. And if you do it like that, you can dominate markets. And you can dominate them fairly quickly, actually, without huge headcount. And with that, I'll ask Scott, do we have any questions?
Absolutely. We have two questions. So the one is, it seems that our connection rates are increasing in this new environment, but occurrences are decreasing. Do you see this, and any suggestions?
Yeah, let's clarify. Connection rates going up would mean that we're connecting a little bit more easily. And we actually have seen a little bit of that. Our data is pretty decent. We do about 50 million dials a year. So since, let's say, mid-March or thereabouts, when the big changes happened and there was a big work from home kind of exodus or whatever, I guess it's not an exodus, right? You're staying home. What we saw since then is we saw first increase in difficulty getting a hold of people, then a decrease, and then a flattening out. And it's kind of where it used to be. So we're still seeing across the board about a 23 to 24 to 1 dial to connect ratio. That's with connect and sell. We have a little waste, I'll call it, built in when we make a connection. We have to throw away some of the dials that are in flight. So think of that as manual dialing. That would be maybe a 19 to 1 dial to connect ratio. What we are seeing is that the ability to get a meeting actually improved a lot early. And I think it's just because people had some time on their hands. Now, I think it's actually come back down, but it's pretty flat. Again, it's just a little bit more difficult to get a meeting now than it was, say, pre-COVID. And it kind of went up, and now it's down just a little bit below the line. It's kind of interesting, though, to me that those things are material, but like anything else in business, all we can really do is look at them in comparison to the alternatives. And the alternatives are having a worse time of it than calling people on the phone. I guess that's why a lot of people are saying the phone is back. I'm not a big fan of the raw phone because I just think it's painful to, to spend so much time navigating phone systems and leaving voicemails that are not going to be listened to, but it still beats the alternatives, and things haven't changed enough to suggest that we put away the human voice.
Great, thank you. Next one. Any ideas you have on finding the buyers that are in the current buying motion or buying cycle?
Yeah, it has to do with the nature of the script that you use in cold calls. You should tune your script to cause people who are in a buying cycle. And by the way, consideration periods tend to run about 1 quarter. So, and normally there's about 12 of those within a replacement cycle. So for most B2B products, it's about 3 years before somebody will replace whatever they bought with something in the same category. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. Some of them are actually rational. You buy something, you probably bought the right thing and you're going to use it until it's not the right thing. A lot of them are political. They have to do with the way budgets are set. You got yours, you're not going to get another one of those for a while. And then part of it is just emotional. You don't want to look like an idiot going back to the well. Hey, we bought a CRM that doesn't work. It's now 3 months later. Let's buy a different one. You just tend to live with it. So you've got about 12 quarters that you've got to deal with. And in only one of those quarters will any given perfect prospect being a buying cycle. So the way I call this tapping the bells. If you had a job where a bunch of bells were going by you on the assembly line, except only 1 in 12 was an actual bell, the rest are fakes. So 1 in 12 is made of brass and the others are made of clay. And instead of ringing it, they just thud. You have no real alternative if that's your job and they all look identical, they're painted identical, they weigh the same amount and so forth, but to tap them and see if they ring. The conversation you have with somebody off the bat is the tapping of the bell. And you need to construct that script and the intonation such that when somebody is in a consideration cycle, they will want to take the meeting and learn more. You're not looking for everybody to do it. Really, 1 in 12 is a pretty good shot, a pretty good level. That's 8-point-something%. So if you were to get the majority of those that are in a consideration cycle, you'll get about 5% on a cold call, which is a pretty good conversion rate on cold calls. That's why it is what it is. The main thing is, though, unless you're going to be in business only 1 quarter, you've got to do something about the other 11. And you can condition them to have future conversations with you in which you have the advantage of being trusted by not blowing the trust. So you have to get some trust and then not blow it. And by figuring out how to talk to them again. Now, one of the beauties of the phone is, this is of the phone in general, people answer the phone by habit, not happenstance. So once you've spoken with somebody, you're speaking with somebody who is likely to be, I'll call it an answerer, a phone answerer. Somebody like me, I irritate the living daylights out of my fiance by answering the phone almost every time it rings, not every time. And, she says, well, I never answer the phone. Oh, some of us do. So if you're cold calling me, you got a reasonable shot of having a conversation. And if you can intrigue me with something of interest, and then this is most important, you have to avoid the false negative that comes from blowing it. And the easiest way to blow it is to say what category of solution you're offering. Because as soon as you say that, you're calling that person incompetent or not diligent. That is, you're saying, here's something really important that you should have known about, and you were waiting for a salesperson to tell you. If it's important to them, they know it's important. They don't need you to say that it's important, or that there's a solution out there. But they do need to believe that there's something about you and your firm that's going to offer them insights, and the insights are going to come in the meeting. So the product is the meeting. Product becomes the meeting, and the meeting is the product. And that's the key to actually figuring this thing out. You can look at intent data all you want, but from a competitive standpoint, that intent data is available to everybody. And business is competitive. You've got to win. It's not enough to have somebody kind of look at you after they've decided to go with somebody else.
I got another good question for you too, about Plan B. So in your Plan B, what is the ratio of SDR to AE you suggest?
It depends how heavily armed your SDRs are. But my suggestion is, I like my SDRs to set 2.3 meetings per day, and I like my AEs to take 2 meetings a day. And that gives me an opportunity with reschedule calls and all that to have a net show rate. I don't give a damn about gross show rates. I think gross show rates are meaningless. One of the best things in the world to happen is that somebody doesn't attend a meeting, and then you call them and say, hey, we had this on the calendar, something must have come up for you. When would be a better time? I'd much rather have that second meeting than the first meeting. There's no doubt about it. The blown meeting is your friend in sales, and if you can't treat it as your friend in sales, you need to get more experience in sales. So if you can, your net show rate can be 2 out of 2.3, then my AEs are holding 2 discovery calls a day. And if they're holding 2 discovery calls a day, we like to have a fair number of false positives and laters and all that. I'm hoping for them to convert 1 in 5 of those to something, not a deal, but to a test drive. And so then 1 in 5 is about 2 a week. That would be 8 test drives a month, and I'm a pretty happy guy. But you got to do your own math. It has to do with the flow rate of conversations per day. To accomplish that, by the way, that 2.3, the reps are going to have about 20 to 30 conversations a day. That's about the right number. Your ratio is not really a ratio of SDR to AE. It's a ratio of conversation flow rate to SDR and conversation and meeting flow rate to AE, and then the conversion between conversations and meetings is what links that math together.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, you hit it on the spot. You got to know your metrics, and you got to work around your metrics. You can't let the metrics run you. So great point. That's all the questions I got for you.
Cool. Well, thanks, everybody. I really appreciate it. I'm going to do something in a pandemic that I haven't done since March 13th, go get on an airplane, not to go to a conference. And should I survive, maybe we'll talk again someday.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.